Well, I know you're all enthralled by what you've seen so far, and it is available to you on YouTube for further viewing. We do want to take advantage of...
Or at the Avery Research Center.
Or at the Avery Research Center, sorry. We want to take advantage of some folks that came to speak with us today. We want to get you thirsty for what they have to say and what we have to say. The main thing that I get from this film, and I've seen it many times, and I get chills every time I come to the realization that showing our connection. And the song that they're talking about in this film is a burial song. It's a funeral song. And somehow that's part of the reason why we're here today. So thank you so much. And now Dr. O will come forward. He will introduce to you the speakers for our occasion. And from here, we're going to go to the beach, put your feet into the water that those slaving ships came through, and then we'll come back to the cove and have our ceremony and our libation sharply at 12 noon in synchronicity with Virginia, Panama, Brooklyn, Oakland, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and many more. Okay. Panama.
And St. Croix.
All right.
And Georgetown.
And Georgetown. All right, Dr. Ofunniyin.
Lafayette.
Good morning.
Welcome, sir.
Today is about memory, and as you saw in the film, memory is something that they like to say we've lost. Memory of our history, memory of things that connect us to our ancestors, and language is an important connector to those things that we need to remember. And when you evaluate, or when you look at history, history tells us that when our ancestors were taken into captivity and brought to the New World, certain things were immediately taken away from them. One of those things was the language, their access to language. Their long-term access and usage of language was forbidden publicly. But of course, you can't forbid someone from using their language in private. So we continue to do that. And this elder who had the wisdom to store memory in the mind of this youth through a funeral dirge, something that the ancestors would hold on to and ensure we would remember in a funeral dirge. Today's guests, speakers, Teju and Wumilawe, Jai Wumilawe, we were students together at the University of Florida, and we were connected through the Center of African Studies. And when I got to the University of Florida, Teju, the husband in this team, was on the committee that was to welcome me to this college. So he was one of the very first persons that I met, and we befriended each other. And a year later, his now wife, Jayola, came to the University of Florida, and I was on the committee to welcome her. And over time, we got to know each other, and before the two of them got to know each other, I got to know each of them. And so I like to tell the story that I said to one of them, I can't remember which one, I think it was her, I know a good person for you to marry. And they married, and we've traveled together and doing our research, spent time in Nigeria, and so today they're going to talk to you about some of their research, but more importantly, about reasons that we need to remember and things that we need to remember. So without further ado, I'll invite them forward.
morning, everyone. Good morning. We're going to speak some African terms today. So you all have learned the term alafia, and that means peace, or peace be unto you. And I will say a karo, and everybody say a karo back to me. And that actually translates as good morning. My husband's setting up here. We're going to do a tag team type of presentation. My presentation today is the Middle Passage and the meaning of ancestors. And just a little backstory to piggyback on Dr. Baba's introduction. That's what we call him, Dr. Baba, or Dr. O. His introduction gave you when he met us, but I want to tell you a little bit about before I met them. And I must say, it's the ancestors that brought me to meeting Dr. O, as well as my husband, Dr. White. And about 1997, 98, I started becoming committed to the idea that I would have a relationship with my ancestors, spiritual ancestors, which I will go into a little bit of detail about today. So I made that decision. Of course, the ancestors said, okay, you're open to us now. We will help you along in this process. I met all types of wonderful people who helped me to understand how I could have a relationship with my spiritual ancestors. And a year later, I met Dr. Baba. The next year, I met Dr. White. And here I am before you today, about 14, 15 years later. A little background on this talk. I have a PhD in African history, and so my specialty is Africa. So we're going to do a half and half program. My other specialty is that I'm a Yoruba priestess of Oshun. So we're going to do half history, half spirituality. So if you'll bear with me in that. So the Middle Passage and the meaning of the ancestors. Yes, what was happening in Africa before and during the Middle Passage? Now, just a little background on what the Middle Passage is. I'm presuming that most people in the room actually know what the Middle Passage is, but some people may not. So I want to define it for you. And I will say that between the years of 1526 and the 1880s, it's sketchy because there's a lot of smuggling going on. Between those years, 12 to 25 million Africans were shipped from the coast of Africa, West Africa, and Central Africa mostly. But my husband will go into a little more detail about that. They were shipped to what was called the New World, and that includes North America, South America, Caribbean, etc. So only 3 to 4% came to these shores. 40% of the 3 to 4%, which equates to around 500,000 Africans over that 400-year period. 3 to 4% came to North America, and 40% came through Charleston, as many of you know. So this is an extremely important location when we're talking about anything about the Middle Passage. I want to also state that this was the largest, biggest ever imaginable forced migration in human history. There has never, ever been anything like this in human history. Okay, so what was going on in Africa at this time? Most societies in West and Central Africa were farming agricultural societies. So I have a picture here of women with their rice plants, and you see they're smiling. Because I want to emphasize, because a lot of African Americans don't understand that farming was a technique for freedom. To be able to grow your own food and support yourself is a way of having unprecedented livelihood, because you don't have to only depend on nature to supply you with the food that you're going to eat. And as we all well know, that's the only way we can survive, is with food. But since we were forced to farm on this side of the continent, a lot of us have this disdain and think that farming is something that, you know, only impoverished people do, or that is not appropriate for a reputable human being. But in fact, it's a technique for freedom. So people were farming in Africa. There were, I should point out that there are thousands and thousands of different cultures and ethnicities in Africa. Most people think it's just Africa. But in fact, people spoke different languages, they had different governments, they had different systems, philosophies, and views on life. But there were some commonalities. And one commonality that we see in many parts of Africa was that spirituality was infused in the government. So we're still a spiritual people. We keep that alive today, as we see by this wonderful showing for recognition of ancestors. And so I want to give this information that this is what we were doing in the homeland. Now, as far as how did people become enslaved? Most people were captured through war. Now, does war sound familiar in Africa to you all? Yes, it does. And if you think that it is not connected to this time period from the early 1500s, then you're sadly mistaken. Because wars raged throughout Africa, mostly for state expansion, not necessarily to capture people, but as we know, Europeans came to the shores with their boats. I'll get into the boats in a minute. To what Africans thought, they actually thought that Europeans must have eaten African people, because these people come to the shores and they get people by the boatload. They take them off to a place never to be seen again, because people, 9 times out of 10, did not return until the later part of the Middle Passage. But in any case, Africans thought that Europeans were the cannibals. Now, of course, Europeans turned that on Africans and said that they were cannibals, as well as they said that about a lot of indigenous people. But Africans had a really good reason for believing that Europeans must have been cannibals, because what are you doing with all of these people? You must be eating them. But this was through war. So, and I want to point that out too, because given the fact that a lot of Africans sold other Africans into slavery, a lot of us can't reconcile with that idea. But we should point out that it wasn't the majority of people, that the majority of Africans wanted to live peacefully in their villages and towns and cities, because there were cities even back then. They wanted to live peacefully, but there were some war-mongering people who thought that they would be able to have subjects and or be able to exchange other groups of people. People would not sell their family. Let's be clear, they would sell other groups, people who didn't speak their language, etc., into slavery. So, and I have here reports from the interior, because I want people to understand that for the most part, people didn't live on the coast. This was not an ideal situation, because outside of food and shelter, and love, what is the most necessary element for human beings? Water. You can't drink seawater. So people would live on rivers in the interior parts of Africa. So when we think about that whole concept of people being forced from the interior, we also have to understand that when people were captured, before they even got to the door of no return, which is very popular, I think most of you are familiar with that concept, people were forced to walk hundreds and hundreds of miles. Sometimes they were enslaved by 3 and 4 different people before they even got to the dungeons, before they got on the boats. So here we are at the boat. Door of no return, we can have that image in our head. When people were asked to get on the boats, they may have already been enslaved for as much as a year. And then they're being asked, well, not asked, they're being forced, and in the most despicable way. You know, just the idea that they were even human beings didn't occur to the people who were the captains of these boats. They were forced onto these boats, put in the bottom, in a hull, and this ride is 2 to 3 months long. People are there in filth, dirt, disease, anything you can imagine. That's just the most disgusting situation. People were intentionally separated from their family. Usually this separation happened long before they got on the ship. People were treated like animals, which I stated before, and you can imagine 10 to 30% of people did not survive. And I believe this is part of what we are all here for today, is to try to elevate those spirits that perished during this time. I should also point out that a third of people, somewhere between 10% and 30%, actually perished before they even got on the ships. So when we're talking about the numbers, historians, and I can tell you this because I'm a historian, historians have calculated the amount of people that were recorded on the ship logs. So their estimates are between 10 and 12 million people. That's why we estimate that it can be as much as 25 to 100. Some people estimate that it was even 100 million people who were enslaved during this Middle Passage. So, the Africans that lived and those that died were reflecting on the meaning of ancestry. So I'm going to transition, taking off the professor hat, putting on the priestess beads, and we're going to transition into that. And I am going to call on one of our most fantastic ancestors that have transitioned recently, Dr. Maya Angelou, and I'm going to read a snippet of a poem that she recited to the Million Men on the Capitol back in 1995. She said, I say, the night has been long, the wound has been deep, the pit has been dark, and the walls have been steep. But today, voices of old spirits sound, speak to us in words profound. Across the years, across the centuries, across the oceans, across the seas, they say, draw near to one another, save your race. You have been paid for in a distant place. The old ones remind us that slavery's chains have paid for our freedom again and again. ... The ancestors remind us, despite the history of pain, we are a people who will rise again, and still we rise. So, who are the ancestors? I want to make a note that there is a difference between the physical ancestors and the spiritual ancestors. If you don't walk away with anything that I've said today, please walk away with that. That is a tool for empowerment And if you don't understand that concept, you can get into some murky waters. And we today are trying to get out of the murky waters. So, the difference, spiritual ancestors are deceased relatives that had a long life, usually had children, were upstanding citizens, ethical, and left a legacy, because we have some people in our community that they left such a fantastic legacy. If they didn't do any of this other stuff, they didn't have a long life or whatever, they would be considered ancestors as well. However, physical ancestors only, because the spiritual ancestors are physical ancestors too, but we have people that passed, that died in our families that do not qualify as spiritual ancestors, but of course there are physical ancestors. So, but if they're only physical ancestors, there's a likelihood that they died young or died early, that they weren't parents at any point in their life. And that doesn't mean actually birthing a child, because you don't have to have a child to be able to raise a child or be a parent. We all know that. People that were social menaces that just, caused a ruckus while they were here on earth and did all types of crimes, and those that perished or died tragically. Those are people that we usually consider physical ancestors and not necessarily spiritual ancestors. Now, I am very pleased that people are not looking at me like with anger, because people get upset about this sometimes, thinking, well, I thought that my Uncle Johnny was an ancestor and I've been worshiping him as a spiritual ancestor, but he's just a physical ancestor because he was a criminal and he died at 25 years old and blah, blah, blah. But there's always something that we can do on behalf of the ancestors. So how do we engage the ancestors? We engage the spiritual ancestors differently than we engage the physical ancestors, but we can engage all of our ancestors. So, with spiritual ancestors, we pray, libate, and offer to. With physical ancestors, we pray, libate, and offer for. We do it on their behalf. Because the idea is that if we're on this planet and we're attempting to become spiritual ancestors, we might actually, on this earth while we are alive, have more power in our prayer than they do as a spirit, in the spirit world. So we pray to elevate them. We want their spirits to be elevated. Because you don't want to call on Uncle Johnny, the criminal, who died when he was 20 and was a social menace and all of this, to help you and to, do all of this work for you if he's going to come and bring the wrong energy. We don't want that. So we want to pray for his elevation. He may have even been reincarnated into another individual, gets another chance, because reincarnation is truly an African concept. You will find this in lots of different cultures. We keep records of both, though, for various reasons. And we learn more about that every day so that we can know what we're in for as a people. So, build altars, yes, we can build altars, we celebrate. So, I wanted to point this out because as we are commemorating and celebrating today, we want to be sure that we call on the energy of the spiritual ancestors, and we want to be sure that we help to elevate the physical ancestors. And why are we doing this? Because it provides us with identity. It provides us stability. The ancestors will give you spiritual awareness if you are open. They will talk to you. And you want to listen because they can protect you from harm.